The sun had barely risen, casting pale light over the town as Clay Brennan's wagon rolled into the mercantile. He made this trip every month for as long as he could remember. The weather had been harsh this winter, and supplies were low, but it wasn't just the goods he'd come for today. It was a familiar routine. Clay was a man of few words and fewer attachments, still haunted by memories of his own family, lost to a fire 5 years ago. But when he saw them, two children huddled against the cold stone wall of the store, it was like time stopped. The girl, no more than 7, had wrapped her small arms around her baby brother, clutching him close in the way only a protective sibling could. She looked up as Clay's wagon creaked to a stop, her wide eyes full of something he hadn't seen in years: fear, confusion, and a kind of quiet desperation. The baby was wrapped in a worn flour sack, his face pale and contorted in the soft rasp of a cough that sounded wet, like his lungs might give out at any moment. The girl shifted uncomfortably, her protective nature evident as she adjusted her brother in her arms, even though she could barely hold him. Clay stepped down from his wagon, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. As he got closer, he could see the signs of how bad it really was: ripped clothes, dirty faces, and the way the girl's shoulders sagged under the weight of the responsibility she shouldn't have had to carry. A woman sat nearby, her face pale and tear-streaked, barely holding it together. Clay recognized her immediately: Ruth Carver, a woman whose name had been whispered through town for years now, mostly in hushed tones. Her husband, James, had died under mysterious circumstances, leaving her with nothing but debts that had buried her in shame. Her sorrow was the kind that could wear a person down until they had nothing left to fight for. Clay's heart clenched at the sight. He'd lost everything once. He'd watched as his wife and child were taken from him by fire and smoke, and the helplessness that had followed him ever since filled him once more. But this was different. This wasn't a family in the past. These children, sitting in the cold, had no one. He knelt down, carefully avoiding the cold stone, and reached out to the girl. "Let me help," he said softly, his voice rough with the weight of something he couldn't quite explain. The girl shrank back, clutching her brother tighter, but she didn't speak. Her eyes darted from Clay to the woman. Her mother, he assumed, but Ruth only stared at the ground, defeated. The silence between them was suffocating. Clay didn't wait for permission. He lifted the girl and her brother in one fluid motion, cradling them both against his chest. The girl's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. She hadn't been held like this in far too long. She relaxed just a little, but still her eyes stayed wide, full of mistrust. The baby's weak cough made him wince, but he didn't stop. "No more. Not today," Clay muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with resolve. He didn't know why those words came out. They were just there like a vow. But as soon as they left his mouth, he knew they meant more than a simple promise to these children. They were a declaration to himself, too. He wasn't going to stand by and let this happen. Not to them. Not again. Ruth's voice trembled as she stood, her eyes flashing in panic. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone a mix of fear and disbelief. "You can't." Before she could finish, the store owner, Granger, appeared in the doorway. His broad frame cast a shadow over the cold stone, his eyes hard and calculating. "You don't want to be doing this, Brennan," he warned, his voice low and gruff. "That's Ruth Carver you're hauling off. Her husband died owing half the town." Clay didn't hesitate. He glared at Granger, then back at Ruth, whose face was painted with a mixture of shame and uncertainty. "She's got claim to human decency," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I'll be damned if I stand here and watch 2 kids freeze to death because you're too scared to do anything about it." Granger narrowed his eyes, a slight sneer tugging at his lips. "You take them to your ranch, people are going to talk. That's all I'm saying. People in this town, they don't forget easily." Clay wasn't moved by Granger's threat. He could hear the warning in the man's voice, but he didn't care. He had made up his mind. "I'm taking them," Clay said flatly. and no one is going to stop me." With that, he turned and walked toward his wagon, the children still clutched in his arms. Ruth, though, was still standing there, rooted to the spot, unsure of whether she should stop him or not. She opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again when she saw the look in Clay's eyes. Something beyond pity. Something stronger. "Get in," Clay ordered, helping the girl and the baby into the back of the wagon. Ruth hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, she climbed in as well, sitting as far from Clay as the small space allowed. As the wagon began to roll, Ruth finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't pay you," she said, the weight of those words heavy between them. "I won't be able to repay you." Clay didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked ahead, the road stretching out before them. He could feel the frost in the air, biting at his skin, and the strange heaviness in his chest. He didn't want her gratitude. This wasn't about that. But it was the first step, a step that felt as if it might change everything. As they passed the edge of town, Ruth's voice broke through the silence again. "My husband, James, was a gambler. He lost everything. The homestead, the cattle, everything we had. He lost it all in a card game. And when he died, he never had a chance to make good on those debts." She paused for a moment, her voice trembling. "And now I'm left with nothing." Clay glanced at her briefly, but didn't respond. He had his own past, his own ghosts to contend with. But right now, there was no time for that. They had a journey ahead of them, and it wasn't just about getting Ruth and her children to safety. It was about surviving the storm that was sure to follow. As the wagon rumbled on, Ruth leaned forward, a look of fear in her eyes. "Harrison Yates won't like this," she warned, her voice a mix of caution and dread. "The last man who helped me, his barn burned down 3 nights later." Clay's grip tightened on the reins. He didn't know who Harrison Yates was, but he could already feel the weight of that name pressing down on him. He didn't know how far this was going to go or how dangerous it might become, but he had made a promise to those children, and now he was about to learn just how much that promise would cost him. As Clay's wagon rolled away from the town and toward his modest ranch, the first rays of the sun began to break through the cold morning mist, casting a faint golden light over the landscape. Clay could feel the weight of the children in the back of the wagon, the exhaustion from their journey, and the quiet, unspoken tension that hung in the air. Ruth, sitting beside him, remained silent, her face a mixture of disbelief and worry, as if she couldn't fully accept what was happening. It had been years since she had known any kindness, and the notion that someone would risk his own safety for her and her children seemed almost too much to bear. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the wheels of the wagon creaked along the dirt road. The silence between them was thick, and it seemed as though the weight of her past was pulling her further into herself. Emma, the 7-year-old girl, sat quietly next to her baby brother, Tommy, who had finally fallen into a deep sleep after devouring every bit of food Clay had given him. He was sick, too. Clay could hear it in the way the baby's breath rattled in his chest, a sound that made his stomach twist with worry. But there was nothing to be done for him yet, not until they reached the ranch. Emma watched Clay warily, her eyes following his every move. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of trust, or perhaps hope. She didn't say anything, but she didn't shy away either when he reached to gently adjust Tommy's blanket. She was learning that not all men were threats, even if her life had taught her otherwise. The drive to Clay's ranch took only a couple of hours, but the cold had settled deep into their bones, and Ruth's hands shook from the chill as much as the emotional weight of the situation. Clay's ranch was nothing fancy, just a small, modest plot of land with a few cattle and an old farmhouse that had seen better days. He had always lived simply, his work his only true companion since the fire that had claimed his wife and child. The small nursery room inside the house, with a covered cradle, still ached with memories of the family he'd lost. But as he drove the wagon past the barn and toward the house, he could sense the children's apprehension. Emma looked around as if unsure whether this was a dream she could wake from or a reality that would change everything. Ruth, too, seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed somewhere far off, but there was no turning back now. Clay helped the children down from the wagon and led them inside, where the warmth of the fire was a relief from the bitter cold outside. Ruth stood hesitantly at the door, unwilling to cross the threshold, as if she were waiting for some sort of sign, some form of reassurance that this was not a trap. Clay glanced back at her and nodded toward the fire. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Ruth didn't answer at first, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she were trying to decide whether she could afford to trust him. Finally, she took a tentative step forward and entered the house, her children trailing behind her. Clay's modest kitchen was simple but welcoming. The fire crackled on the hearth, sending warmth throughout the room, and Clay quickly set about preparing food for the children. Emma didn't touch her plate at first, her eyes flickering between her mother and Clay. It was clear she wasn't going to eat unless Ruth gave her permission. But Ruth seemed too tired to argue, too exhausted by the weight of the world bearing down on her. Clay noticed the quiet tension, the way Ruth tried to suppress her own hunger for the sake of her children. Finally, with a soft sigh, Ruth spoke. "Go on, Emma," she said, her voice weak. "Eat." Emma hesitated, but then sat down at the table and began to eat in small, measured bites, as if testing the waters to see if it was truly safe to do so. Tommy, however, didn't need any coaxing. He dug into his meal with desperation, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Clay watched the children eat, his heart heavy with the realization that they had likely gone without food for too long. There was something deeply painful about watching children eat like this, like it was their last meal, a frantic urgency in every bite. The weight of it pressed on Clay's chest, but he didn't let it show. As the children finished their food and settled into a more peaceful silence, Ruth and Clay moved to the kitchen table, where Clay placed a fresh pot of coffee in front of her. She looked at it but didn't drink, her fingers curling around the mug without taking a sip. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Ruth broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her words full of confusion and fear. "I don't know why you're helping us. We have nothing to offer you." Clay's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair, studying Ruth for a long moment. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I'm not doing this because I want something from you. I'm doing it because no one should have to live like that. No one should have to watch their children suffer." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, ashamed. "You don't know anything about suffering," she said bitterly. "My husband was a gambler. He wasted everything we had, and when he died, I was left with nothing but debts and broken promises. Harrison Yates, he tried to take advantage of me after James died. He tried to make me a housekeeper. He wanted me to be something more, and when I refused, he ruined every chance I had to make a living." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the years of pain and betrayal finally coming to the surface. "Emma asked me last night if we were going to die, and I didn't know what to tell her." Clay's heart tightened at her words. He had lost his own family, his wife and child, to a fire, and he understood the hollow ache of grief. But to have to endure that kind of fear, to be unable to protect your children, was a different kind of suffering. "You're not going to die," Clay promised, his voice thick with emotion. "None of you are. Not while I'm around." Ruth let out a shaky breath and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something more vulnerable, as if she had begun to let down the wall she had built to protect herself. Just then, a shadow passed by the window. Clay stood abruptly, his instincts on high alert. He didn't tell Ruth what he saw, but in that brief moment, he knew that someone had been watching the house. He didn't know who it was, but he was sure it was someone sent by Harrison Yates. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The danger was already here. Ruth didn't seem to notice, but her unease was palpable. She had been running for so long, trying to keep her children safe, but that safety was slipping through her fingers. Clay had promised her protection, but now he understood how much that promise was worth. He had no idea just how much trouble he was about to find himself in. 3 days passed with an uneasy calm. The children began to adjust to their new life on the ranch, slowly finding small pockets of comfort. Emma, though still wary, started to help Clay with the morning chores, feeding the horses and gathering eggs. She had a quiet way about her, like she had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Tommy followed Clay around like a little shadow, his large eyes full of wonder as he explored the ranch. Ruth, meanwhile, insisted on doing her part, mending clothes, cooking meals, and cleaning. It was clear she wasn't used to being taken care of, and the feeling of dependence weighed heavily on her. Yet, even though things seemed calm, Clay could feel the tension building. He was growing more and more aware that the danger wasn't just an outside threat. It was something he couldn't avoid. Yates's grip on the town, on Ruth's life, was something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. But for now, he could only keep his promise, to keep them safe for as long as he could. That promise, though, was beginning to feel like a thread pulling him deeper into a web of trouble. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. Ruth's warning about Harrison Yates still echoed in his mind. The last man who helped me, his barn burned down 3 nights later. And Clay knew that the clock was ticking. The day Clay rode into town alone, he could feel the weight of what he was about to face pressing down on him. Ruth had wanted to come, but he wouldn't let her. He couldn't risk it. The tension that had been building ever since they'd left the ranch had finally reached its breaking point. The smell of the cold earth and the distant sound of cattle in the distance seemed to mock him as he rode toward the mercantile. The town was quiet, too quiet, and Clay had a gut feeling that everything was about to change. As he tied his horse to the post outside the mercantile, he could feel eyes on him, the watchful gaze of a town that had already made up its mind about Ruth and her children. He stepped inside, nodding to a few familiar faces, but when he tried to approach the counter, Granger, the store owner, shook his head and stepped back, his face tight with tension. "Not today, Brennan," Granger said, his voice low but edged with warning. "Yates says anyone who does business with you is done in this town." The words hit Clay like a punch to the gut. He had heard rumors, of course, stories about Harrison Yates, the local banker and power broker who had his claws in everything and everyone. But to hear it spoken aloud, to know that Yates had already begun to turn the town against him, made it all too real. Clay could feel his blood boil, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "You know it's wrong, Granger. This is extortion, plain and simple," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just here for supplies." Granger's lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't want no trouble, Brennan. You know how it is." With a frustrated sigh, Clay turned away from the counter, his fists clenched at his sides. He needed supplies, but he wasn't going to get them here. As he walked toward the door, he could feel the eyes of the townsfolk following him, some with pity, others with fear. They all knew what Yates was capable of. Clay, though, wasn't going to back down. Not this time. As he stepped outside, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He didn't know how, but he could feel it. Something was coming. He mounted his horse and rode toward the saloon, determined to confront Yates head-on, even if it meant risking everything. When he entered the saloon, the thick haze of smoke and the clinking of glasses seemed out of place, as though life continued as usual despite the tension that was thick in the air. Clay scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on a few familiar faces, but it didn't take long for the mood to shift. The saloon grew quieter as 3 of Yates's men surrounded him. One of them, a tall, gruff man named Holt, stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his pistol. "Mr. Yates wants to talk," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. Clay stood his ground, not flinching. He had come this far, and he wasn't backing down now. "I'm not interested in talking to Yates," Clay replied, his voice low but firm. You tell him I'm not afraid of him." Holt's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything else. Instead, he motioned for the other two men to flank Clay, making it clear that they weren't giving him a choice. Clay wasn't intimidated, but the presence of these men, the way they watched him like predators circling their prey, made his stomach tighten. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Still, he couldn't let that stop him. If he was going to protect Ruth and her children, he had to be willing to face whatever came next. With a final glance at the men, Clay followed Holt out the door, the rest of the saloon silent as they made their way to the back of the building. There in the shadows stood Harrison Yates. Clay had heard a lot about the man over the years, but seeing him in person was different. Yates was in his 50s, well-dressed, and smooth in a way that made Clay uneasy. There was no warmth in his gaze, just cold calculation. Well, if it isn't Clay Brennan," Yates said, his voice like velvet, smooth and dangerous. He took a step closer, sizing Clay up as if he were a piece of livestock being evaluated for sale. "I hear you've been causing trouble." Clay's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not the one causing trouble here," he shot back. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Yates smiled, but it was a cruel, predatory smile. "What's right?" he repeated, as if the words were foreign to him. "The law says Ruth Carver's debt's passed to her. That's the way it works." Clay's fists clenched. He had already heard the story. James Carver, Ruth's late husband, had borrowed money from Yates. But Clay wasn't about to let Yates turn that into an excuse for his cruelty. "That's not the law. That's extortion," Clay retorted. "You're taking advantage of a widow and her children, and I'm not going to stand by and let you do it." Yates's expression hardened and his eyes narrowed. "You can't protect her forever, Brennan," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening tone. "You're just a rancher. Your whole operation is built on credit. Your cattle contracts go through my banks. Your water rights? All of it is in my hands." Clay didn't flinch. He had heard enough. He was ready to make a stand. "I'll make sure every rancher in this town knows what kind of man you really are, Yates," he said, his voice firm. "They'll see you for what you really are." Yates's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of genuine anger in his eyes. "You don't threaten me, Brennan," he spat, his voice cold and dangerous. "Threaten me again, and it won't be your barn that burns down next. It'll be your house, with everyone inside." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Clay could feel the weight of the threat, but he didn't back down. "Try me," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with resolve. Yates studied him for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked away, signaling his men to follow. Clay stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The threat had been made, and there was no going back now. He knew what he had to do. As he turned to leave, he could hear Yates's voice again, distant but still laced with warning. "I'll make sure you regret this, Brennan. All of you will regret this." Clay didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had made his stand, and now he had to follow through. When he returned to the ranch, his mind was racing with the knowledge that things were about to get worse. Ruth was on the porch when he arrived, her face tight with worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with anxiety. Clay didn't mince words. "He threatened me," he said, his voice grim, "and he'll stop at nothing to get what he wants." Ruth's face went pale, and she looked down at the ground, her hand trembling slightly. "I should leave," she whispered, her voice full of fear. "He won't stop until we're gone." Clay shook his head. "Running won't help," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "He'll just come after you again. We need to stand together." As he spoke, a sense of urgency settled over him. He had promised to protect them, and now it was clear that the fight had only just begun. The morning after Clay's confrontation with Yates, the winds had shifted. The weight of the threat was no longer a distant concern. It was now a looming presence. As the sun crept over the horizon, Clay felt the heaviness of the situation settle into his bones. The barn, which had been a symbol of his modest prosperity, was now his primary concern. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He was right. By mid-afternoon, The flames reached the sky. Clay, Ruth, and the children were inside the house when the smoke began to billow in from the direction of the barn. Clay's heart raced as he rushed out the door, his boots pounding the earth. The sight that greeted him nearly stopped his breath. The barn was engulfed in flames, the crackling fire eating away at the structure as if it had been waiting to be set alight. He could see the shadows of men retreating into the distance, their horses kicking up dust as they rode away. Ruth was already outside, her hands over her mouth in shock. Emma stood close by, holding Tommy, both of them looking on in terror. The fire was a message, a warning. The cattle had scattered, frightened by the blaze, and the hay and feed that had been stored inside were now nothing but ash. Clay stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of defeat settle on him. The barn, the last piece of security he had for his family, was gone. His cattle were lost, and everything he had worked for seemed to vanish in a single, cruel moment. But he couldn't afford to let despair consume him. Not now. It's not your fault, Ruth said, her voice breaking as she stepped toward him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was also something else, a quiet resilience. Clay nodded, though the guilt gnawed at him. The fire was a direct message from Yates, meant to scare him, to push him into submission. It wasn't just the loss of the barn that hit Clay hardest. It was the realization that this wasn't the end. Yates was testing him. The stakes were higher now. "We're leaving," Ruth said suddenly, her voice full of resolve. She grabbed her bag, already packed, and started toward the wagon. Emma, still clutching Tommy, stood motionless, her wide eyes staring at the devastation. "No, Ruth," Clay said, his voice sharp. "We're not running." She froze, her back to him. "What are you going to do? Stay here and let him burn us out?" Her voice cracked with the desperation she'd tried so hard to hide. "Running won't stop him. He'll just keep coming. We have to stand and fight." Clay's words cut through the air, but Ruth wasn't convinced. She was already worn thin by fear, and now the fire had made it real, too real. She turned toward him, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice broken. "I can't keep putting my children in danger." Her eyes shifted toward Emma, who had finally started to move, her gaze locked on the charred remains of the barn. "I can't lose them," Ruth said, her voice trembling. Clay stepped forward and put a hand on her arm. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You don't have to do this alone." Ruth's eyes softened for a moment, but the fear was still there, deep in her chest. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she admitted. "James, he gambled with our lives. I never wanted this for my children. I never wanted them to live like this." Her voice trailed off, but Clay could see it. He could feel it. She was a woman broken by the world, yet still holding on, still fighting for her children. He looked toward the barn again, the rising smoke reminding him that this was far from over. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice low but firm. "We have to." The next day, Clay made the rounds to the neighboring ranches, hoping for an alliance, for someone who would stand with him against Yates. But one by one, ranchers turned him away. Tom Merrick, a young rancher with a family, showed him a threatening note from Yates, just the kind of message that Clay had expected, but Merrick wouldn't risk his family. Samuel Green, an older rancher who had seen too many battles in his time, simply shook his head and told Clay, "Not my fight." Old Henry Moss, a rancher who had lived on the land for decades, agreed to stand with him, but his help was limited. "It's just me and you, Clay," Henry said, his voice gruff. "That's not enough." Clay felt the weight of those words settle in his gut. He was alone in this, more than he had ever been. Ruth was right. Everyone was too scared to fight Yates. The power Yates held over the town was suffocating. It seemed that no one had the courage to challenge him. Clay had never been a man to back down, but even he could see the odds were stacked against him. The fire had made it clear. This wasn't a fight he could win alone. But there was still one option left. He could ride to Cheyenne, find a judge who would listen, and bring the law into this. It was a long shot, but it was the only option left. The journey would take 2 days away from Ruth and the children. But he had to try. There was no other choice. As he prepared to leave, Ruth approached him. "You're going to leave?" she asked, her voice soft. "I have to," Clay said, his voice strained with the weight of the decision. "I need to find proof, Ruth. I need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." She nodded slowly, her face conflicted. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. "I don't want you to leave us." Her words hit him harder than he had expected, but he couldn't afford to stay. "I'll be back," he promised, kneeling down in front of Emma. She was clutching Tommy in her arms, her face full of worry. "You'll be here when you get back?" she asked, her voice small. "I promise," Clay said, his heart heavy with the weight of his promise. But as he looked up at Ruth, he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. He wasn't sure if he could keep that promise, but he had to try. As Clay rode out of the ranch and into the distance, he glanced back once more. The orange glow of the fire still lingered in his mind, and he knew that Yates wasn't going to stop. Not until he had everything. And Clay, for the first time in years, was ready to fight for something bigger than himself. Clay's ride to Cheyenne was long and exhausting, the harsh winds biting at his face as the sun dipped low behind him. Every mile he covered brought a weightier sense of urgency. He couldn't afford to waste time, not with Ruth and the children back at the ranch, vulnerable to Yates's wrath. The trail seemed endless, but there was no turning back. By the time Clay reached the outskirts of Cheyenne, his body ached, his face windburned, but he pushed through the exhaustion. He needed proof, and he needed it fast. When he arrived at the local judge's office, he could feel the skepticism in the air. The judge was an older man, his gray hair thinning at the temples, and his sharp eyes didn't hide the doubts he had about Clay's intentions. At first, the judge barely glanced at the papers Clay handed him. The testimonies from the neighboring ranchers, the stolen financial records showing the extent of Yates's manipulation and deceit. The judge's fingers hovered over the records, but didn't touch them, as if fearing the trouble that might come from getting involved. "This isn't enough," the judge muttered, almost to himself, flipping through the pages with little interest. "You're asking me to take on Yates, Brennan. Do you have any idea what that could cost me?" Clay's patience was worn thin, and he leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "It'll cost you nothing if you don't do anything. Yates will keep running this town, and people like Ruth Carver and her children will keep suffering." The words hit harder than Clay intended, but the judge's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he took in the weight of the situation. "You know what he's capable of, don't you?" the judge asked, his tone taking on a more serious edge. "I know exactly what he's capable of," Clay replied, his jaw clenched. "That's why I'm here." The judge hesitated, then finally nodded, reaching for the papers. "This is enough for an investigation," he said quietly. "But it won't be enough for Yates to back off. I'll send a U.S. Marshal with you." Clay nodded in relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Marshal, a no-nonsense man named Greer, would be his backup for the journey home, and Clay couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. With the Marshal at his side, he might just stand a chance of taking Yates down. He wasted no time gathering the necessary provisions and riding back toward the ranch with Marshal Greer. The journey was tense, the atmosphere heavy with the knowledge that trouble was likely waiting for them. As they neared the ranch, Clay felt the gnawing sense of dread return. Ruth and the children were still out there, and Yates wouldn't stop until they were either broken or gone. When they reached the ranch, Clay immediately noticed the tension in the air. Ruth was on the porch, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky as she approached him. Clay shook his head, trying to mask the anxiety that churned in his gut. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice tight. He hadn't told her about the threats Yates had made in the saloon. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But Ruth could sense the change in the air, and she seemed to know without him having to say anything. "It's happening, isn't it?" she whispered, her eyes flicking to the horizon. The reality of the situation had begun to settle in. Yates wasn't going to back down, and neither was Clay. There was no escaping this fight. Just as Clay was about to speak, his gaze caught a flash of movement in the distance. It was a rider galloping hard toward the house. Clay's hand immediately went to the rifle at his side, his instinct screaming that something was wrong. Ruth stiffened beside him, her eyes wide with panic. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice strained. Clay didn't answer right away. He couldn't afford to take his eyes off the approaching rider. When the rider drew closer, Clay saw the familiar figure of old Henry Moss, his face grim, his horse covered in sweat. "It's them," Henry said, his voice tense. "They're here." Clay felt his heart sink. He had hoped the marshal's presence would deter Yates's men, but it was clear now that the battle was unavoidable. 6 riders appeared over the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. They were too far away to make out faces, but there was no mistaking their purpose. They were coming for Ruth and the children, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Ruth's hand tightened on Clay's arm, her face stricken with fear. "Clay, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't let them take us." His heart ached as he looked down at her. But there was no time for comfort, no time for second thoughts. He couldn't back down now. Clay looked at Henry, then at the children, who had appeared on the porch, their faces drawn with fear. "Get them inside," Clay ordered, his voice firm. "Take them to the root cellar and stay there. Lock the door behind you." Henry nodded, his face pale with worry, but he didn't argue. He ushered Ruth and the children inside, the urgency in his movements adding to the tension in the air. Clay didn't wait. He quickly grabbed his rifle and positioned himself by the door, watching the riders grow closer. He could hear the pounding of hooves in the distance, a sound that would soon turn into a confrontation. He knew it was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the riders reached the edge of the ranch, Clay's breath hitched in his chest. His grip tightened around the rifle, and his heart raced. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let them take Ruth and her children without a fight. Clay stood his ground as the riders pulled up in front of the house. Their leader, the man who had been with Yates in the saloon, dismounted and looked at Clay with cold, calculating eyes. "You've made a mistake, Brennan," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Clay didn't flinch. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can take what isn't yours," he said, his voice steady, even though every part of him screamed for action. The standoff had begun. The sun rose slowly over the ranch, casting a soft light on the land that Clay Brennan had fought so hard to protect. It had been 3 months since the fiery standoff that had nearly destroyed everything, and the difference was staggering. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger than before, thanks to the help of the ranchers who had once been too afraid to stand against Yates, but had now come together to ensure the survival of those who had dared to fight back. Clay stood outside, watching as Ruth and the children moved about the ranch with a new sense of ease, no longer weighed down by the constant fear of Yates's men. Emma, the 7-year-old girl who had once been so guarded and wary, now helped with the horses every morning, her laughter ringing through the air as she talked to Clay about the animals and her growing confidence. Tommy, who had once been sickly and frail, was now a healthy, lively child, running around the yard and playing with the farm animals. Ruth, too, had begun to blossom in ways Clay hadn't expected. She was no longer the same broken woman who had been lost in despair when they first arrived. There was a quiet strength in her now, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of fear and hardship. She had her own garden plot now, carefully tended and growing steadily, a symbol of the new life she was building for herself and her children. The ranch itself had transformed from a place of quiet solitude to a true home, filled with the sounds of laughter, the smells of fresh food cooking, and the rhythm of daily life. The community had shifted as well, no longer an isolated town ruled by fear, but one where people were starting to stand up for what was right. Even Granger, the store owner who had once warned Clay about taking Ruth in, had come around, offering supplies without question and apologizing for his past actions. The shadow of Harrison Yates no longer loomed over them. He was in jail, awaiting trial for his crimes. And for the first time in years, the town felt like it was breathing again, free from the suffocating grip of a man who had controlled so much through fear and manipulation. Ruth stood in the doorway of the house, watching her children with a quiet smile on her face. There was a softness to her now, a peace that had been absent for so long. When she saw Clay approaching, her smile faltered just slightly, and there was a brief moment of uncertainty in her eyes. It was the same uncertainty that had been there when they first met, when she had been unsure of whether or not she could trust him, whether or not she could allow herself to believe that someone could truly care for her and her children without expecting something in return. But now, 3 months later, things had changed. The wall she had built up had begun to crumble, replaced by something more fragile but real: hope. As Clay reached her, he paused for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. "You're looking well," he said, his voice soft but filled with genuine warmth. Ruth's smile deepened, though it was still laced with the quiet weariness that had never fully left her. "I feel like I'm starting to breathe again," she admitted, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Like maybe I can let myself be happy." Clay nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't easy to let go of the fear that had been ingrained in her for so long, to trust that things could be different, that they could finally be safe. "You've earned it," he said simply, his eyes warm as he looked at her. The words hung between them for a moment, neither of them sure what they truly meant, but there was an unspoken understanding that things had shifted. Things had changed, and they were no longer just surviving. They were building something together. The sound of Emma's laughter cut through the air, and they both turned toward the children, watching as Emma showed Tommy how to feed the chickens. Her voice filled with excitement as she taught him the little lessons that had once been lost to them both. It was a sight that filled Clay's heart with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope for the future, hope for the family they were becoming. Ruth's voice broke through his thoughts, a little hesitant but steady. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," she said, her eyes meeting his. Clay turned back to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Ruth took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to ask something that had been weighing on her. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "Why did you help us? Why did you fight for us when you didn't have to?" The question was simple, but it carried so much meaning, so much more than just a matter of survival. It was a question that went deeper, a question about trust, about what it meant to choose someone else's well-being over your own. Clay didn't answer right away. He knew that there was no simple explanation, no easy words to say. But as he looked at Ruth, the truth came to him, quiet and unspoken. "I told myself it was for my wife and child, the ones I couldn't save," he said, his voice low and rough. "But when I saw you and your children, when I saw Emma holding Tommy, I realized I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't want to live a life without meaning, without purpose." Ruth listened, her gaze never leaving his. And in her eyes, Clay saw something shift, a recognition, an understanding that hadn't been there before. "I think I was afraid too," Ruth said after a long pause. "Afraid of hoping again, of trusting again. James, he gambled with our lives, and I couldn't let myself fall into that again." She looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at Clay. "But I think I'm starting to believe again. In us. In this." Clay's heart beat faster at her words, but before he could respond, a sudden cry broke through the air. It was Tommy, calling out from the yard, and Emma was already running to him, her face full of concern. Ruth's face softened instantly, her protective instincts kicking in. She was a mother always. But now, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. As she turned toward the children, Clay stood still for a moment, watching them. His mind, though filled with questions, was quiet. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply be. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He had found something rarer than gold, a family, a home. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it was enough.